the button. I believe we are live. So welcome to episode live stream, 17 now? 18? I think we're
Who's
17.
counting?
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of these. So yeah, today we are very happy to have a fellow podcasting co-host duo of both and Jared and Jason are here. I'm going to be adding their links to the info, but just like these live streams, I'm not very tech savvy. So stand by and you will have links to their awesome podcasts, because Jared just started one called With Jared James, I believe. And yeah, so guys, I've been on your podcast before. We've been in our mutual circles between the Stoa, between Adam Roberts' excellent side view journal talking about metamodernism and memetic mediation and all such content. So today was kind of like let's just get together and start talking. And there's been a few different threads. I feel like we've been discussing the role of regenerative cultures and practices and how that may or may not be related to sort of either synthesizing or integrating leftist communities and maybe more conservative communities around the themes of Cosmo-localism. So we've been kind of talking about, how do we bridge the gap between these different communities in a regenerative way? Because everyone is on planet Earth, right? We're all in the terrestrial. So how do we kind of navigate into a period of quote unquote meta crisis where we're all going to have to be living together, and building together and growing food and eating together, right? So what does that future look like? And are terms like integral left or integral right or integral politics even helpful? Should they be kind of floating above or adjacent to that terminology? Dare they kind of come down into the murky polemics of these debates and discussions? And then beyond that topic, anything you guys want to talk about? Matt, Ryan, do you guys have any comments on that before we get started? Cool. Yeah. So yeah, welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
Big fan of the podcast, Growing Down.
Yeah, we speaking in both and I guess to put some context there, we're actually wrapping it up and going on indefinite hiatus. And in the last episode, I think we're going to do one more. We're going to hand out awards to a bunch of the different episodes that we recorded. But in the last one,
and if you're really nice, Jeremy, we'll give an award to your episode.
Yeah. I think I will give it an award. Yeah, I'm kind of a Jeremy Gebsarian fanboy. I think I'm speaking its praises in instances. And yeah, in that podcast, we were both kind of saying like, well, we feel good handing the baton to Growing Down because yeah, you guys seem to be really operating on a very similar wavelength, but taking it in new directions.
Although Jared, you're a rabid anti-leftist, so this seems strange that you're saying this now.
I'm not an anti-leftist. That's just my heritage is from the right. But yeah, I maybe I could start with this because, as you said, there's this kind of integral left-right dynamic, and whether it should just be integral. And I think I actually have started to be a little. I'm kind of pro the dialectic as opposed to some sort of centralization or distillation or what I feel like there's a few people are talking about like a congealing things or there's a phrase here that's missing that I'm missing, but yeah, somehow reaching a hard consensus is a little less interesting to me, and I actually like the left-right dynamic and the polarity because I think that kind of creates this kind of harmonic resonance in some sense. So the more we allow for that oscillation to happen, I think the healthier things end up in the long run. So I don't know, maybe a good place to start off.
I'm curious because you guys, I think, identify more with integral than Jared and I, although we definitely, we're definitely influenced by integral. But so, and I like what you're saying, Jared, about the need for this oscillation. But, my understanding of integral is it was originally meant to kind of transcend this left-right. And then, I don't know, it seems like that from the integral left perspective, the mainstream integral has kind of become neoliberal, this kind of centrist where they think they've transcended it, but they just become this neoliberal centrist. And perhaps is this kind of oscillation that Jared's talking about necessary to, have this dialectic without becoming a neoliberal centrist? I don't know. That's just something that crossed my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I'll just chime in real quick and say that was part of our motivation, I feel. And Matt and Ryan, you could definitely contribute to helping me remember with that. This podcast started during this election cycle, during the primaries, and we were all just getting heavily involved. And I think everyone's political biases were just being worn on their sleeve, particularly in the integral theory community. And we clearly saw what was being passed as sort of elevated or above or bypassing any kind of political disposition was almost explicitly, in a lot of cases, very much in the centrist, very much perhaps in the neoliberal, et cetera. So rather than avoiding the terminology of being called a leftist or progressive, or even, on the right, because we were talking quite a bit about the whole rise of economic populism during the election cycle, we decided to just go with it, right? To kind of embrace the dirty polemical word, right? Like, yeah, okay, I'm going to be on this side. What does it mean to be on that side and also be an integralist or be an integral oriented thinker? Because we have these biases. So in some sense, I guess, and I'm using this very lightly, it's kind of like a little bit of shadow work in that sense of like, okay, let's just really own where we're coming from and explore that dynamic, like you're saying, in a much more potentially dialectical process of synthesis. And then also, in the Gibbserian sense, what is our phenomenological disposition when it comes to our sense of the world, our sense of time, where we're headed, et cetera. So all of that kind of really came out in a much more clear way once we kind of said, okay, we're coming from a progressive leftist position. What does that really mean? And is that reconcilable with some of our ideas? So I don't know, Ryan, Matt, you want to jump in with that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for me, and this is something we had talked about, another reason why we started the show is because we felt like a lot of leftist literature in particular was not really being scrutinized through an integral lens. And a lot of the mainstream integral political voices like Jeff Salzman, like the kind of media he watched and the kind of books he read were basically like mainstream establishment, like MSNBC, CNN media. And he read a lot of like pop cultural books that were, like Malcolm Gladwell kind of stuff. And we were like, well, where are the integralists who are really talking about like, Marx or post-colonialism or even some of more like developments in social justice and I have a very big interest in seeing the pathologies of the left and seeing that some of these memes that are circulating around in the woke cultures, right, or social justice communities are manifesting in an unhealthy way. And I didn't feel like anyone was really doing the hard work of separating the baby and the bathwater of taking those exact ideas that could be weaponized or bastardized and actually upgrading them to an integral level of expression, right? So what started to happen was a lot of concepts like white fragility, right? Which, I mean, that's like the most radioactive term in the past month or so. But I read the book, I read White Fragility twice. Okay, I really went through it. And while I have a lot of criticisms of what Robin DiAngelo was saying, I still feel like there are pieces that were worth investigating. And some of her framing might have been very divisive and inflammatory and not helpful. But if we are able to save the nugget and then put it through the integral remix machine and express it at a higher level where the truth of it is included and the pathologies are automatically shaved off, then I think that could save the left in a way. So I also have interest in doing the same thing with conservatism. But my two co-hosts we're more focused on the leftist stuff, and we can get to that later. So yeah, I'm trying to take the same content of the left and then express it through a higher level, so to speak.
Yeah, I'd say it's kind of funny too, because Jason, as Jason called me out, I come from a more right orientation, and yet the interesting thing for me is that the reason I like your guys' perspective so much is because even though my predominant stance might be a little bit more from a kind of hands-off, liberty first approach to these problems, there's nothing that you guys are talking about that I don't think is important, and the intentions I think are almost exactly in line. So maybe what we're saying here is that like an integral or metamodern, because yeah, to Jason's point, I'm not really, I don't know how I could use the integral title because it's not something I've been deeply ingrained with, but metamodernism, meta-rationality, integral, they all kind of Hansi stuff, they all kind of mesh together for me. So yeah, but it's a weird thing where it's like I might have more right orientations, but I kind of agree with everything. So really, it's just like, let's have nuanced conversations. And to your point, I don't really see many nuanced political conversations on either side, and with the exception of you guys. I take in the majority of the content that comes in is progressive these days. And it's because it's like, I just haven't really found that there's not a ton of interesting things on the right. It's just rehashed cliches that I've heard when I, became fascinated with Ron Paul in 2012, So, yeah, I don't know.
So Jared, when you talk about your right kind of background, can you talk a little bit more about that, about what attracts you to that, or a little bit more?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it probably, a lot of it comes from this kind of, it's probably extremely personal in the sense that, to get very personal. So I have a chronic illness. And so I was born with something called cystic fibrosis. I also had a few run-ins or one particular run-in when I was like 7 with, I had got E. coli. And so I was in the hospital for a few months and went into a coma and stuff. So it's like, this kind of like medical adversity has been part of my life since the very beginning. And for whatever reason, I was lucky enough to be able to respond to it and see it as something that I could take responsibility for, as opposed to feel like that I was like a victim of. And actually, when I talk about it now, I think it's kind of like one of the unfair advantages of my life is how much adversity I was forced to deal with from a young age, and was luckily had the tools and the parents and things like that to be able to do that. And so, yeah, there's part of me that I think that initial inkling of like the value of taking responsibility, personal responsibility, and wanting to self-improve and things like that are kind of the foundation of my whole intellectual and kind of spiritual orientation. And so that just kind of led to me when I did get into politics being like a pretty hardline libertarian for quite a while. But then, things started falling apart, and yeah, now I don't really identify much with that, but I do still kind of predominantly see things from the first lens the first pair of glasses that I wear is like, how is this going to empower individuals to make good decisions and eventually lead to kind of complex emergent dynamics between groups of healthy individuals.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I know it's something that stood out when you said that was Wilber's saying of transcend and include. And so I think, at least with maybe Steve McIntosh's developmental politics, there's this sort of, transcend and include the previous sort of level of stage of structure. And I know, I definitely believe in that same, the right or traditionalists or conservatism seem to have this really emphasis on that, the upper right, individual behavior, take responsibility for yourself. And so, yeah, I think also just on my thoughts on how this podcast started, I think it definitely was kind of going at a little bit of integralists and trying to understand why more, at least on Twitter, weren't backing Bernie, and trying to understand kind of how Ryan was saying, what's the perspective on that and why is that? And I think this really whole journey has really been trying to understand, if there was integral politics, what would that be? And so I think our discussion as of late has been sort of, where is that balance between left and right, and does integral, where does integral fall in that? And I know I'm reading up on Hansi's books, and there's a quote here that talked about political metamodernism is at the center, suspended clear in the sky. And so it seems to be, trying to transcend the left and the right, and trying to see if there's perhaps another way of coming up with a consensus or deliberative point of view, which tries to integrate both sides without so much squabbling in between. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that how I interpret Hansi is he's advocating for more of a process point of view. And I think you're hinting at that there, Matt, where, metamodernism isn't about taking a left-right position, but it's about, creating a new process for decision-making. You mentioned deliberative. He does a pretty good job in the Nordic ideology to lay out so what is democracy really, right? It's, representative democracy, you have direct democracy, you have deliberative democracy, and you mentioned one other, I don't remember. And it definitely seems like he was clearly on the side of the deliberative democracy. And I don't know how closely this is related, but he also made the point or made the wish that metamodernism would be closer to every major ideology than the ideologies are to each other. And so that might, I don't know what that means in terms of left or right, but, and he doesn't shy away. Like he mentions liberalism, he mentions communism, he mentions fascism, he mentions, all of these kind of, great strains of ideologies, and highlights a lot of their virtues. But I guess if you're throwing in, okay, so it has this proximity, to every ideology somehow, and it has a process orientation, what would that mean for, there to be a left or a right metamodernism or a left or a right integral, if we're going for the same idea with the integral movement?
Yeah, and then what is the left? I mean, what does that mean? I mean, for me, it's also about, I'm very, I don't know, visual, but to have okay, well, here's what the left means and here's what the right means. And the problem, I think, these days is there's so many mixed definitions. And at least for me, I agree with some of the left, I agree with some of the right, and then trying to, how do you mix all that together and try to have, if this integral metamodernism is sort of this new way of seeing or a different way of doing politics, just what is that exactly? And I think just by having our guests on and just, it's been helpful to have different perspectives and conversations about what that might mean.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned, the thing that came up for me is, I think the most obvious culprit of the insane diversity on what left and right mean seems to be around, social media creating these kind of very hyper bubbled communities who continue to kind of self-perpetuate and extreme and become more and more extreme. So it's almost like the left-right spectrum of a couple of generations ago was about as wide as just in the left and just in the right now. And they can't even talk to each other, so it's not even, the left isn't even convivial. And so, yeah, it's a big, quite the task. But to Jason's point, I think it really is important. I think, integral metamodern, if that could be kind of more of the foundational, or kind of maybe it would kind of act as a grand narrative in the sense that the one unifying thing is that we all do kind of see that the process should look something like an integral or metamodern framework. And yet we can all have drastically different perspectives and opinions on how to move forward. But if we all agree that we still have some sort of relationship or a closeness with something in common, it allows for there to be some respect and not so much demonization and kind of otherizing that's so easy to fall into these days.
Yeah, and I'll just say it's really amazing how some of my friends who are conservatives, one of my friends stands out in particular. He also started as a libertarian, and then he became more of like a, what's that, Mencius Curtis Yarvin. He became like a Curtis Yarvin fan, and then really leaned more towards like traditional conservatism, like almost like pre-industrial conservatism. And the way he got into it was not necessarily because of policy positions that he supports or doesn't support, right? It was because he had bad encounters with the left and was particularly disgusted with some of the bad, what he saw as bad aesthetics of the far left. And in a kind of like spiritual yearning or longing, he's sort of gravitating towards very traditional forms of aesthetics and ethics and identity. And so I guess my question would be, as you just said, Jared, right, we can disagree on the specific policies with how to move forward. And the reason why I would consider myself nominally left is because most of the policies I support now are generally categorized to be progressive economic and environmental policies. But when it comes to appreciating the perspectives of libertarianism, right, the appreciation of how government can become very clunky and inefficient, and we do need to have a more decentralized, organic, bottom-up approach, or traditional conservatism, right? Strong emphasis on personal responsibility and family and church and community, and tight Gemeinschaft kind of moral structure of small groups and communities, right? Or even bring in some of the Christian dimensions that they feel like is being run roughshod over by atheism and postmodernism. And so I can appreciate all of them a lot and find connections with people in that way. So I guess for both of you guys, my question would be, under the umbrella of integral left or integral politics, what are some specific values or memes or perspectives from maybe conservatism or libertarianism or localism or whatever that you would like to see being highlighted or emphasized more by us or people in our communities, so that we could maybe draw in a more diverse, audience?
Read Wendell Berry books. I'm reading The Unsettling of America by Wendell Berry, and I think it's a really well written book, and I consider him a traditional conservative in many ways, right? His conservatism and localism just happens to be rooted in connection with the land, right? And for him, land and agriculture, is the basis of culture. And I largely agree with that. And I think, so for me, we're bringing in this, you mentioned kind of like more local, organic, emergent, economic and political processes. But I think in general, if we look at the rise of industrial agriculture, and this is what this book is about, and how it's created this kind of hyper specialization where, okay, people are taken off the land, they're given the affordance to specialize in various things. And that's had a number of consequences. One is the ecological consequence, which I think is undeniable, with topsoil loss, biodiversity loss, decreasing water tables. But it's also, he argues, it's made us economically hyper specialized, or it's been part of it. It hasn't been the sole factor, but it's been a big part of it where, if you're living more off the land and in general, you're more of a generalist in general. Like, when you were a small scale, when you had a lot of small scale farms, you had a lot of generalists in the population who could do many things and weren't, completely reliant on a fragile system, right? If public services went down, communities were still able to take care of themselves. And today we see that much less. And, you can argue that that's a fundamentally conservative, kind of in the original sense perspective. And it's a localist perspective that, in general, I mean, if I were to critique, I don't know as much about integral, but if I were to critique metamodernism, Hansi metamodernism, I think it's a very kind of Northern European, urban, elitist kind of perspective. And I take a lot of issue with that.
Yeah, I might add even, it's like something that's been alive for me when looking at these things and saying like, yeah, there's a lot of, kind of conservative perspectives on how we live. I agree with Jason in the sense that like the relationships, the local relationships that we have, which require a far deeper interaction between reality tunnels too, because we're not able to, virtually live on our own little knowledge islands. But yeah, it's funny that, my critique of the conservative line is like, hey, you guys just aren't conservative enough. Like if we're talking about traditional values, let's look at humanity from a broad perspective. And if I'm a traditionalist, I'm looking more toward like a indigenous traditionalism. How are humans supposed to genuinely live together in in tribal type situations. And I also still feel like this the internet and the digital playground is equally important, so that we can keep communication up between these different groups and learn from each other. Because if we do become locally siloed, I don't think that works out well either. The 60s were a good show of how fragile it is. So yeah, it still has to be deeply integrated, and I think the digital infrastructure is what we're needing. But yeah, the industrial agriculture and just economy in general are what seems broke to me. And so the fact that the more the hardline conservative view is that we should go back to an industrial way of living is absurd to me, and not sustainable in any way either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jeremy, you mentioned Cosmo-localism at the beginning, and I think it's a good time to bring that in, because it's not the kind of localism where we're not going back to feudal Europe or something. We have and this is where the technology comes in. We have the digital technology to communicate, and also to share. And in the Cosmo-localism part, at least I'm familiar from the Michel Bowen's version of that, where you're developing kind of local communities, local commons, but you also have this kind of digital commons as well. And one example of this is in the manufacturing realm, where you have this kind of like global digital commons of manufacturing knowledge, that is widely shared, but then it's it can be adapted to the local circumstance, right? So it's kind of modular, it's kind of adaptable, and it creates kind of a level of interconnection and intelligence that kind of cross-fertilizing intelligence that wasn't possible in the past with more of a traditional localism that when people criticize localism, that's what they have in their mind, right? And I think that technology affords us kind of a neo-localism that has this cosmopolitan component, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. I think I'm very attracted to the terminology cosmo-localism, because I think it's another way of phrasing what the late Michael Brooks talked about in terms of cosmopolitan. Now his phrase is cosmopolitan socialism, and that adds a whole other package that we don't have to go into at the moment. But the cosmo-local idea, I think, is very interesting in that it is retrieving localism, and it is addressing some of these incrementally and exponentially problematic tendencies of industrialization, ecological collapse, et cetera. It addresses all of that. And it also says we need to get back to land and hyper-localism, right? And so our politics needs to be both hyper-local and international. And the way we relate to that internationalism in the future may just be, hey, we just share how to build things. We just share like, okay, how did we figure out some kind of ecological regenerative issue where we weren't able to grow enough food last year? Well, this community halfway across the world figured that out, and we're sharing that mutually with each other. That's all it may be. And in terms of tradition, religious practices, other community practices, that might be much more local in a way that we haven't seen in this process of industrialization. So I think in terms of any kind of mutuality between the left and the right, I do think it falls on both communities and both practices and theorists looking at the problem of globalization, right? And how do we overcome the crisis of globalization, how it's taking away labor from local communities and jobs, how it's destroying the environment and land, et cetera, how it's extracting wealth and resources from previously very resilient and local communities. This is both a hyper-local and a planetary oriented issue that we all have to address. And I guess for me, like Ryan was saying, a lot of the policies on the left, not all of them are perfect. A lot of them are kind of intermediary in this sense, like the Green New Deal and MMT, like Matt Segal brought up. Like, well, what happens if the U.S. dollar loses its global power in terms of its value? Well, then what do we do with MMT? So I think there's some issues with that, but we can both address this overarching crisis of globalization. Like, globalization is imploding upon itself, And I think when it comes to the context we're talking about, the left and the right are both looking at what comes after that, or how can we get back to the local? How can we make communities more resilient again? And so there might be some crossover, not only with policies, but just with a general sense of like, here's what we're all struggling with, right? Like this trajectory, like Latour talks about, of the global, it is largely responsible for this crisis. And so the future looks both hyper local and then also cosmopolitan in a way that hasn't even been achieved, right? Because our cosmopolitanism at the moment is achieved through this globalization process of extracting wealth, and outsourcing productivity and labor to the cheapest, available workforce, wherever that is in the world. So that process is not beneficial for anybody but the elite, right? So we're all on board with that. And I think this is what Matt and Ryan and I were both talking about towards the beginning of this podcast with economic populism. And I know there's been a lot of arguments about that, but can there be a thing of economic populism on the left and the right? But I do think in terms of what we're talking about in this context, there can be. So anyway, yeah. So those are just my initial thoughts here.
Yeah, I would just add too, something that came up is, Jason was kind of saying, one of the elements of that localism is that those communities are allowed, are so much more robust, so that if some of our centralized institutions or social services do take a hit for whatever reason, or are somehow dysfunctional and not addressing core needs, a lot of that happens because they're very generalized and not locally and contextually represented. Suddenly the cosmopolitan socialism term pointed me to the fact that the other thing that this does is that it brings that social support to a very contextual local level, and then the cosmopolitan angle too is that if one of the, like you said, one of the things that happens is that we can kind of open source and share information to help other localities. But another thing that's very, that interaction builds a bunch of rapport between different communities, which also leads to situations where, maybe somebody has a really bad drought, and instead of sharing, they could ask for help. And because they've been so protective in the past, then they can fall on the cosmopolitan layer of support, and somebody who feels most capable of being able to help out might be, that same type of reciprocal relationship could be happening at the cosmopolitan level as well. So yeah, it's
a clear-cut example that, so I'm reading a book right now by Mark Shepard, Restoration Agriculture. And one example that kind of fits in with this sharing, this kind of cosmopolitan thing, and this is a kind of an ancient thing, but this is kind of crossbreeding various varieties. So he brings up the example of like the American and Chinese chestnut tree. And the American chestnut tree was wiped out by blight, brought over on, some ship, I think from China, like in the early 20th century, and it was basically wiped out. And, and these two trees have different properties. I think the Chinese chestnut tree produces, is more, I forget which is which, but like one of them is more cold tolerant and one of them is more kind of bounteous, right? And one example of kind of sharing knowledge across localities is this kind of crossbreeding in agriculture, in a not, and I don't mean genetic modification in the GMO sense, but I mean actually like he uses the stun method where you just plant like a bunch of different varieties of trees, let them cross-pollinate and see which ones survive, and kind of get the, and so you can kind of adapt, you collaborate to, to adapt various, you could say, ecological or other technologies to a particular location. Now that's kind of an aside, and that might be taking us in the weeds. I have so I definitely consider myself a localist, but, a devil's advocate point of view, or might ask, how do you, so, people talk about this concept of exit versus voice, right? And if you have, with localism, you're never, and with people having the ability to kind of define their communities, you're never going to have communities that have values that you don't agree with, right? Looking from another perspective, right? So you might have a very fundamentalist Christian community, right? And a lot of fundamentalist Christians are very attracted to localism for this reason, because they want to get back to the land. A lot of them are interested in permaculture, but they also want to, define very, they have a set of values that they really want to live by. And, from this point of view of exit versus voice, you could say, okay, well, maybe according to a certain type of community, there's not voice in this community. Like maybe it's not democratic in a way that we would like, but is there exit? Can people leave and join other communities? I'm wondering what you guys think about that.
I would say no exit, you have to stay, almost like a cult-like kind of demeanor would probably work best. But I also, just a real quick thought on that too. I wanted to just add in a little thought I had before I forgot when you talked about metamodernism being elitist. I have a bunch of these quotes and I'm going over here, and one of them from the Hanzi book talks about political metamodernism needs to be elitist to attract and engage the highest effective value meme. And so I think also a little bit with what you're saying with, okay, if you're really attracted to localism and it attracts mostly fundamentalists, whatever side you want to come from, I think, and Jared was talking about this too, a political process that I just got it right here too. Hanzi talks about, you take a transpersonal, dialectical, and developmental view on politics. So to me, it's like politics has to be able to take in all these different specialties that have grown through humanity, and here we are at this point in time, and how do you develop this collaborative process in order to, like you said, have people have voices, but like also have exits if they're not, well, I'm not too engaged with cancel culture, identity politics. So what does that mean for me if I identify as a leftist? And so I think that's also that self-organizing principle that's going on here. People are trying to find where's their niche, where do I grow the most? And that, I guess, to kind of advocate for kind of Hanzi's thing, I really like how he is also addressing the inner dimension of our lives. So it's not just this kind of exterior shell, but also how does the political process, tap into each of our own inner lives and make sure when we flourish that perhaps we could, kind of be our best self.
This is not directly answering your question, but just let me rephrase the question. I think that I said before in context of what you answered. So with modernity, we had, and secularism, like secular humanist modernity, you had this dream of kind of like some kind of universality, and that was part of globalization project. And and we can talk about the extraction component of that, but then there was also kind of like universal human rights, a lot of the things that the United Nations advocates, right? And I guess the thing that I'm wondering about is it okay to not have a voice as long as you have exit, right? So should there be some kind of universality in terms of like universal human rights and some kind of monopoly on power to enforce those rights, or do we need to think of it in a completely different way? And I want to get to your point about the inner dimension in a bit, Matt, but I just wanted to follow up on that part.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jared, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this was something I was thinking about just a minute ago, where we were talking about the locality. It obviously, and even this Cosmo-locality, there's going to be somewhat connectedness, but there's still going to be some inherent competition. When there's a lot of local freedoms and certain effects in one place are going to have permeating effects in other places. We were just talking about unplanned, kind of collateral damage of our local actions. I think this is always going to come up. And so I do think that there, especially since we are global right now, there has to be a global mechanism. And I'm just afraid of it being a governmental global mechanism. And that's why, the solution that or kind of the general orientation to this problem and kind of proposed solution that's been most appealing to me was actually simple, which is the guy that we interviewed on our podcast as well, which is kind of like it's a bottom-up consensus mechanism where all of the people choose to say, like, here are our minimum standards. And if people don't, and then if politicians and governments don't support them, then they lose the support of the people. So it's like, it has this really interesting quality of being completely bottom up, and yet it has no interest in making any kind of impact except for at the global level. So it's this very, we're talking about these oscillations. And so that is probably the most appealing. And to Jason's point, I think that would be a way of dealing with some of the human rights stuff as well. Because we have to allow for, it's uncomfortable truth in the sense that freedoms are going to be different. There's gonna be different levels of human freedom in different groups. There already are, all the societies are like this. So there will always be variances. And yeah, I think exit is essential. And even if exit is available technically, it also needs to be available practically, in the sense that this points again to the fact of why that the digital level of interaction is a core component of these things, so that people aren't completely isolated in their communities. They have other relationships with different people. And so that way, when exit is something that comes up as a possibility, there's actually a route, because they have, oh, well, I have a friendship with somebody that comes from a different place, or I've interacted with this group, or I visited them, or something like that. So yeah, if we become too, even if technically they can exit, but we're still too insular, and there's too much local consensus, it acts as a deterrent to exit anyway. I don't know, Jason, my thoughts. I don't know if that answers much.
I'm just wondering if we can frame this around specific, because I'm very fascinated by this topic, and I actually want to bring this up today, because if I was thinking yesterday on a walk, I was like, if I could have the answer to like one question I've been grappling with, it would be how to balance exit versus voice, or how to balance top down versus bottom up, right? And what situations does that work well for, and what situations or what issues does that actually not work well for? So maybe we can think about a specific topic. I guess I don't even, just so I understand what you guys are asking better, I'm thinking about a situation like gun control, right? So one of the arguments for like stricter national gun laws, gun regulations, instead of leaving it to local counties or jurisdictions, is that if Chicago has really strong anti-gun laws, I can just drive to like the next state, like 45 minutes, pick up like a assault weapon, go back into Chicago and kill a lot of people, right? So it didn't do any good in a local area unless every single person, every single group has the same laws that prevent you from getting a gun. And then we can think about other examples too, like climate or other kinds of collateral damage that can happen if one group has more freedom than the other ones. So it's like, at what point do you just have to go all in on one thing? And then of course there's the other issue too about, like, for example, the argument for Medicare for all as opposed to like a public option is that if you have too many choices, it'll create a two-tiered system where all the sick people will get lumped into the government program and all the healthy people will get siphoned off and put onto private insurance, and the public insurance with all the sick people who need it most would tank. So in some ways you have to go all in on some. Another example too would be like public school versus charter schools, and school choice and school vouchers versus one of the arguments. And I'm not saying I really know what the answer is, but like in the Nordic countries, some people have said that, well, because they don't have a lot of private schools, all the rich people who would normally send their kids to a private school send their kids to a public school, and therefore everyone in the community has incentive to make the public schools the best that they can be, and then everyone, no matter what your economic standing is lifted up because the public schools are serving everyone. So those are just kind of different ways to think about it. So I'm curious if you have a particular issue where we can really hone in on this topic.
Well, before we go into that, I mean, I also just want to say, I think, again, what I'll just be the cutout of Hansi on this episode to advocate for both the top up and the bottom down. I just want to put out that too, but go ahead with whoever wants to answer Ryan's question.
I mean, I think all of those are good topics. I can imagine us talking about all of those. Trying to think of if there's any that particularly resonates with me. I mean, just to get a little bit more abstract, and this might be just a cop out, but when I'm thinking about accent and voice, I can just imagine that some communities will choose not to be democratic at all, right? There'll be little monarchies, right? And so some people have foreseen, if you have this kind of localist patchwork, you're gonna have this kind of neo-feudalism. It's gonna eventually evolve to some kind of neo-feudalism. And so I think you were talking about the issues of scale. And so I don't know, maybe I'm taking it off topic.
No, Jason, this is kind of, you also talked about before we got off addresses, but you also, I thought, mentioned that there were some groups that didn't have a voice, and you were talking about the United Nations and universal rights. Is that accurate?
Yeah. I mean, basically what I'm saying is, if you have, if you have purely a bottom-up decentralized localist system, I think you're inevitably going to have communities that are extremely hierarchical within their boundaries, right? Where people don't have a voice per se, and by voice I mean kind of, some ability to, to speak out against, some kind of political power dynamics within the jurisdiction, right? And and I think what some kind of accelerationist libertarians argue is that no, you don't need to you don't need to ensure a voice. Communities can have it if they want to, as long as you have exit, right? And this is something that I struggle with. It's a question that I don't have a clear answer with, because I personally value voice and some, at least some kind of deliberative process. But again, if I'm saying that should be universal, well, then you need some kind of universal enforcement mechanism to enforce some kind of minimum viable democratic process, right? But then you're getting into kind of a more top-down globalist situation. So it's a very difficult question. I mean, and it's also very abstract, and so who knows how things are going to develop, and this question will probably be a moot point, because there will be unforeseen developments, and so maybe focusing on a specific issue like gun rights is a better way to go about it. So yeah.
I want to I guess I want to challenge the dichotomy between conceiving of the global as needing to be top down, right? Because we're talking about the local in the context of the hyper local, the bioregional, et cetera. But part of what I think anyway is going to be this like turn from globalization to planetization. We don't have this yet, but I think it's evidenced in what we see with what Brooks was talking about with an internationalist left, is something like that would probably continue in a hyper bioregionalized global human culture civilization, right? So we have to imagine that an international solidarity would probably be still online and coordinating and working out some of these social and hierarchical struggles in the local and sharing notes with each other. Just as we are seeing, at least in terms of like a proto cosmopolitan left at the moment struggling with globalization and anti-capitalism, I think we'd probably see that continue or even sort of intensify in terms of these mutual aid networks and kind of the digital commons of leftism. So that's going to be in the mix too. So the question of how we even conceive of the global is so colonized by the modern, right? We have to imagine the global in a way that is not as humanist and modernistic as we've been doing. Even in the context of this conversation, I know that's difficult, but I don't see a way forward. Like you guys, it's like, well, if that's going to be it's going to be some top down, new world order that enforces international law. I don't think it could, even with the aspiration that like, yeah, we really don't want things to get bad in certain territories. I don't think that's the best means to achieve it, right? So there has to be some kind of more networked mutuality in this process that doesn't look the same as the United Nations per se, or some kind of big global planetary statehood, right? There has to be something else. And I don't think we've invented that or innovated that yet, but that's the feeling I get in terms of talking about the planetary. It's kind of prefigurative. And you're right. What can we really say at this point that's as concrete as talking about gun laws or even like what we're seeing in the United States, right? Like this is already happening. Like there's like a desired flight from southern states right now, or like what cities are going to be refuge cities, you know, and what cities are or bioregions or commonwealths are going to be safer to live in and are actually implementing local healthcare policies or, you know, different immigration policies, et cetera. So like we're kind of already seeing this begin to take place here. Anyway,
Yeah, it's funny. I might start. You know, of course, I'm going to make it even more abstract, but in attempt to simplify it, and then I think maybe it could lead to something. You know, one of the things that I see, you know, so I keep saying like this, we still need these interconnect. All of the localities and the different groups and things like that need to be interconnected. And deeply integrated with other groups. I think the fundamental reason that is important is because that interconnection is really an awareness or a transparency of the system. And the cool thing about awareness or transparency is that the more visible and integrated any aspect of life is, the more able it is to fluidly interact with everything around it, right? And so the more siloed things get, the worse it is. And you know, being a meditator, I think of this as like, you know, I'm talking about my meditation experience. You know, if there's parts of my experience that are sectioned off, you know, kind of like, don't go here, don't look at this, it becomes completely, you know, kind of dysfunctional and causes a lot of issues. So yeah, I guess if I were to say, what is this, the globalist top-down thing might be like the minimum viable awareness or transparency of all of our, you know, of all people, so that there's at least some awareness of what's happening in these groups. And if there's an awareness of it, then that means that the exit is that much more possible, because they can actually see where to go. But if it's super insular, there's nowhere, you know, even if it's technically possible, it's hard to know what to do. And maybe if we could to make it the concrete of stay in the spiritual side of things, right? So like I've been spending a lot of time thinking about some of the problems with traditional Vajrayana Buddhism, kind of Tibetan Buddhism, and others, you know, all of these kind of abuse scandals and certain sanghas where things get out of control, and and cults in general, right? Like this is the common thing that they all have, is that they're extremely insular. Nobody knows what's going on the inside, and there's all sorts of dynamics that prevent that barrier to be permeated or whatnot. And so, you know, if we're wanting these to be highly integrated in a broader sense, there has to be a minimum viable transparency there. And yet I'm not dogmatic about it in the sense that I think there are times and instances and contexts where some sort of privacy or limited group of interaction is needed. So yeah, I don't know, just a few things to throw out there. Maybe we could apply that lens to something broader or more specific out of the spiritual world.
Yeah, I think we're navigating a lot of different areas, and some stuff that just comes up for me is when you guys are talking about the top down, bottom down, it really reminds me of the tragedy of the commons and how there's another solution between all just privatization to just, you know, being a systematic solution of being, you know, almost addressing sort of these own sort of little self-organizing systems that are able to adapt. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that work, but that's something that's kind of, you know, made me think of what you guys are talking about. My other question too, that kind of has come up, and we were talking about it before. What are you know, with being, and I guess maybe to even go before going into that question, I did want to ask you guys about your podcast. It's called Both and I know you guys are kind of wrapping it up, but I did want to address this. What did you guys think of that experience? How was it for you? And sort of just looking back and reflecting on, because I think when we're talking about integral and we're talking about metamodernism, this idea of both and really kind of fits in with that concept.
So we talked a lot about this. I'm trying to think of anything original I can say from, we had our last wrap up episode. We kind of did a lot of reflection on it. So I might just be reiterating what I've said, but I thought it was a wonderful experience for me. I mean, it's one of the things I'll look back on and I think be most proud of in my life. And I think one of the things I'm proud of is that we really tried to reach out of our bubble. And the bubble being kind of this kind of so-called sense-making metasphere. And we really tried to bring in voices with very specific points of view to really trying to have a constructive conversation. Everything from kind of like a hardcore utilitarian to, a neo-reactionary type of person, right? And so that's something I'm really proud of. It's funny, I was also reflecting on the podcast of how much, like, we're multifaceted beings, right? And there's a part of me that is really attracted to this idea of memetic mediation. And that was really the foundation of the podcast, is like encouraging these conversations with the idea of like basically having information flows across these memetic tribes. If you apply it to localism, that would be, more physical tribes, but, encouraging this kind of collective intelligence. And, but to be a memetic mediator is I don't think personally you can be a complete person and only be a memetic mediator. Like I do think you have to have skin in the game and have a perspective. And now that the podcast is wrapping up, I feel like I'm now inhabiting more of my partisan lens, which just happens to be kind of, localist, anti-neoliberal, probably a little bit more on the left, but wanting to have conversations with, people on the right who are also in the localist vein, and and being a little, kind of taking a break from my memetic mediation self and actually exploring, having a perspective and developing it and taking it and applying it in my life and taking it where it wants to go. And so, while I would have liked it to keep going, it's all Jared's fault that it finished. And he's the first to admit that. There's a part of me that is kind of relieved to take off that memetic mediation burden for a while.
Yeah, it's funny. So that new podcast that Jeremy mentioned, I just finished the third episode, and it kind of was an attempt to wrap up the memetic mediation, my perspective on memetic mediation, I suppose. And to kind of echo what Jason's saying, one of the things that I talk a lot about in there is that everybody has to put on their mediation pants from time to time, but we play a lot of different roles and we have a lot of different pants. It feels like that was we were hard lined in that role, and yet I don't know. Like we said, we don't really know. I don't know how much traction we got. It's hard to know. What, if anything. There was no like super visible impacts of like, oh well, before both and these two tribes had known each other, no idea they existed, and now they're best friends and they're collaborating or something. That would have been ideal. We didn't see anything like that, so it was kind of subtle if it did happen at all. But I guess it was kind of an invitation. It was trying to create some bridges for tribes to go or maybe maybe not creating bridges, but more of a creating the circumstances where warring tribes or just foreign tribes could start doing the work to build bridges. So maybe it just hasn't manifested yet or something.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of desire for it was to become an institution that, if it kind of kept going over the long term, it would become something that just kind of, became in a certain niche of people's awareness as, okay, these guys were going to give me a fair shot to express myself, to express my point of view. And kind of, going back to this ideal that Hanti talks about of metamodernism being closer to every ideology than they are to each other, kind of having that same thing with both end, where, the fact that we're able to have a very constructive conversation with people all over the political map, it just becomes kind of like this kind of long-term institution that, can, maybe influence, other podcasts, others, whatever, that can kind of, like that kind of role could be cultivated in society of having these kind of not impartial in the kind of like, I don't know, traditional media, Charlie Rose sense, kind of not a neoliberal partiality, so to speak, where the default is always neoliberalism and, but something else.
Yeah, it's kind of like going to international waters where we can just, no strict rules. Let's explore, to tell us about your experiences and your perspective. And Jason and I, we just attempted to be as generous and curious about what was coming up. And one of the metrics that is kind of emblematic of that is that our two top podcasts episodes most listened to, the first one was Michael Brooks, and the other one was Zero HP Lovecraft, who is a kind of provocative, anon, super, I don't know,
dissident
reactionary, dissonant right thing or something. I have no idea. I mean, he's they couldn't be more different, I guess is what I'm pointing to. so it's at least somewhat encouraging that we got a lot of people listening from a broad range, and who knows how many of them stuck around and listened to some others and maybe were really annoyed by us and we're like, what the hell? Why are they talking to this crazy bastard?
baiting and switching everybody. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and Jason, I wanted to just echo what you said about memetic mediator burnout.
Yeah.
And I've actually coined, being a mediator myself, I've coined a term for this phenomenon. I've struggled with this myself. I call it high road fatigue.
Right.
And I'm like, I'm always at my best, trying to mediate people's conflicts and trying to, and this is a very personal thing for me too. I've been struggling with, it's like, I'm always trying to take the high road and be the mediator or memetic mediator and use my skills. And at some point I just want to be like, fuck you,
Yeah.
like I think you're wrong. I think I'm right. And it's like my human tribal self can only put that hat on. I realize I can't wear that hat 24/7. I need to be able to debate. And so to tail off of this, I wanted to ask you guys something else. I really wanted to get your two opinions on, is that on your last episode, you both mentioned you were kind of moving away from the sense-making web, or at least doing as much online activity as you used to. And I've become, and I've talked about this with Jeremy and Matt, but I've become increasingly, in some ways frustrated, but just more a little disheartened by some of the directions that some of these sense-making communities have gone recently.
Yeah.
Where I feel like it's a little contradictory, and you guys can tell me if you think I'm wrong on this, but it seems like for communities that are supposedly valorizing memetic mediation, integrating different perspectives, seeing the larger picture, transcending cultural polarization, there's a lot of doubling down on anti-SJW, anti-left kind of stuff. It seems to be disproportionate, and I'm not seeing like a balance. Okay, and so I have three critiques. One is that if we're going to criticize one segment of the culture, we should also criticize all of the tribes, right? Instead of just doubling down on anti-SJW kind of rhetoric. The second thing is I don't find the criticisms to be very specific. And I feel like people are not really engaging with the literature and really picking up, because I'm fine with criticism. I just want a little bit more precision instead of this general like SJW suck kind of a thing. And the third thing is that I don't feel like the criticisms are very creative or even done in the best spirit of memetic mediation, unification, and transcendence. And they're just, even if we think in these communities that we're above the mudslinging, where it seems to be, like rebel wisdom in the direction they're going in, it seems like kind of doubling down on this kind of IDW anti-far left stance that doesn't seem to be leading to transcendence or unification or healing or whatever. And I'm kind of like, that's another reason why I wanted to really call myself someone on the left and take that stand a little bit more strongly, to try to stand up for to try to create more balance in these communities. And I always have the impulse to balance, and no matter what community I'm in. So if I'm in a group with a lot of people who are very far left and I feel like it's going too far, I'll push back from the right in a way. But I just feel like I don't know what's happening here in these communities. I just want your thought on that, and if you also have any critiques of these communities and what you would like to see improved.
So I mentioned in the chat that I might or might not use the term, reactionary modernism, but I think, the direction that Rebel Wisdom is going, and I mean, to be fair, Rebel Wisdom is going in many directions. I mean, they've had like Douglas Rushkoff on, and had other voices, so it's not the totality of Rebel Wisdom. Peter Lindbergh and crew had like the Cancel God, and so they're, I think their idea is that I think there is, arguably a culture of fear of speaking your mind, because there's going to be implications for your career. And I think, in many cases that's valid. And I think his idea is, well, I want to get ahead of that and basically make this into this egregore, like name it, so like, in meditation, if you want something to be manageable, you name it, right? And so you name this egregore, but it doesn't, you're right, that it doesn't have the nuance, or it doesn't really explore, well, what are the underlying causes of this environment, right? And so it's not very metamodern, so to speak, right? It's not something that, Hansi metamodernism, would engage with. At least I would hope not, right? It would take a much more kind of nuanced perspective. And I really liked, I don't know, Jeremy, do you want to unpack, you had a really nice thread where you were talking about, I think you were taking more of an economic or even Marxist kind of interpretation of, what has been dubbed cancel culture, and to understand that, well, it's actually, if you want to talk about a culture war, neoliberalism already won. So, and so we need to get to the roots of, what are the underlying causes of this atmosphere of, of kind of stifling wokeness that, by the way, all of the big corporations are getting behind, right? Like Amazon has on its, banner when the protests were happening, we support Black Lives Matter, right? And oh, by the way, we just happen to, be taking over the world as we do, as we support these causes. And so, you have to get into, much deeper the kind of the cultural and economic. So Jeremy, I'll let you, I don't know if you want to unpack that a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah. You did a good job though. I mean, basically I was looking at this more from the kind of economic and ideological drivers that hyperpolarization is fueled by, right? Like we use all of these social media platforms that are designed for clickbait, they're designed for polemics, they're designed to incentivize a lot of heated back and forth, and they're designed to silo people because it makes a lot of money, like the algorithms and the economic incentives behind our social media platforms are not human centric. And that's sort of why I quoted that Douglas Rushkoff quote, which he excerpted on Medium from his book Team Human. So yeah, there's a lot of there's like an economic subconscious in a lot of the discussions, not so much on the left, although somewhat on the left. The economic oriented left seems to be more mindful of this. But in terms of the hyperpolarized culture war, it's kind of like free speech versus social justice, right? Without looking at some of the underlying drivers that, mutually doesn't help anybody, right? It doesn't allow the left to unify and coalition build, and perhaps the right is a little bit better at doing that, but it certainly leaves us hyperpolarized, right? So that was sort of the first critique. But in terms of the rest of it, I think, being aware of the historical pressures that Facebook and Twitter and the neoliberal capture of social media are part of this longer extended process of the neoliberal capture of economics, particularly globalist economics, right? What we're talking about with the process of globalization, the removal of labor, the separation even, and I got this as interesting pushback from that series of tweets from other integralists going like, well, you're talking about economics, but I do think that the left won the culture war. And I'm like, this is exactly my point, that economics and culture really need to be seen a lot more in a lot more entangled way, right? So we need to really see how they do affect each other and not see the culture war as the kind of software for this invisible hardware of economics that's driving all of these forces. So I think there needs to be more transparency and a deeper historical awareness of how so much of neoliberalism has really driven a lot of these questions of labor, the revival of the right, and then maybe pathological expressions of the left that has been defanged in a way from actually talking about economic justice. You know, one of the things that came up too about that is I forgot who mentioned this. I don't think it was Matt Taibbi, but the question of, because he got kind of in the middle of this fight himself with that blog about white fragility and etc. But yeah, part of this is the problem that if you separate economic justice from social or racial or cultural questions, then you get, you know, Amazon taking a knee, or you get bank CEOs taking a knee, who are in the process of dismantling and disempowering Black communities all over the United States. They have no interest in actually helping out, no matter what charities they donate to, etc. So really seeing these two as more integrally tied to one another is really, I think, very, very just essential going forward with any critique. And how much our debate has now moved from that. Like, what are the structural, economic, and legal demands of the Black Lives Matter movement? They had some really great ones towards the beginning. And now, just in terms of the social media discourse, it's moved to this whole, free speech versus cancel culture debate. I mean, what happened, guys? Do we see how this actually fuels the ability of these economic ideological pressures to just continue? They want us to be fighting about this rather than talking about actual demands, right? So these are the kinds of concerns I have with the direction it's been going, and I think that was the sort of point of the thread, to really have a more integral oriented perspective of all these different complex dimensions.
And being my cutout for Hansi, right? He talks about like a cultural game change, and I think at least one of the things I think that are similar between our podcast and your guys' podcast is bringing a new voice to the discussion, as far as what, you know, Jared talked about spirituality earlier. Jason, you brought about localism. I mean, not obvious, but that's one of my weakest areas as far as, well, ecological crisis. How do you address that, right, Jason? So, I mean, bringing different voices to the table to try to come up with some of these solutions that we were talking about earlier that just weren't being discussed. And so, yeah, I think even having, you know, again, I'm ignorant about economics, you know, as far as, and so I try to stay, neutral and try to understand what's everything that goes into it, but to really understand from the biggest picture perspective possible that all these things influence one another. And so I think it's worthy, you know, with these discussions, you said, oh, well, who's listening to these podcasts? But at least for me, it's also forming my own political view of the world, and to get a better understanding of how things work, and ultimately, you know, how do you be part of a process that you're trying to make the world better? I think ultimately that's the main goal, as far as how do you help people flourish? How do you help cultures, communities flourish? And admittedly, I don't know the answer. So I think it's helpful to have people that are informed or engaged in this discussion, and that aren't sort of prejudiced to already having, like, you know, we keep talking about neoliberal. Well, that's just kind of saying, well, business is the top value. Well, that's not the top value. How do you engage these other things that are important? How do we recollect sort of the things that we've lost, and so we can start identifying as humans and knowing your neighbor and all these things. So to me, it's about just bringing people to the table that have good points of view. And, you know, going back to the political metamodernism is elitist because it wants the highest effective value. I mean, to me, that's having people on the podcast and talking to people that have a perspective that changed maybe the way you looked at things. And for me, just not getting, I mean, yes, I definitely, if I had to pick right now between left and right, I would say I lean left. But it also is like, it's also worth bringing in, talking about, again, Jared, with transparency and Sangas, what are the blind spots of the left? I don't know if you guys think the left have any blind spots or any that stick out for you guys?
I wonder, if I could pull before we go there, I have like 4 different threads that between Jason and Jeremy and Ryan, I feel like are interesting here that I might try and weave together. First thing, I guess, right? Like the obvious thing is like there isn't an answer, right? And so that is to Matt's point. That's the value of having these conversations, is that it becomes a process and a dialectic and a discovery, and something that's more fluid and evolving. And so, yeah, seeing our kind of mental and physical ecosystems healthily, when mental and physical ecosystems are thriving, they're highly dynamic and very responsive and constantly changing. And so I think that maybe, if there's a hint of an answer, it's like, this is the characteristics of what thriving life looks like, is that it's extremely flexible and moving and fluid. The interesting thing, pulling back to what Ryan's saying, is like this, the sense making space, especially, has kind of, it seems like they're kind of doubling down or regressing back to this, let's respond to the caricature of leftism with a caricature of modernism. And it's just like, it's not helpful at all, because it's not, they're both just straw men in their own ways. And so I think that one answer to you guys' point is to like, all right, well, let's critique leftism from more of instead of the perspective of why is it stupid and ridiculous and everything like that. It's like, actually, let's find the nuanced part of this and say, like, tying in this accountability measure. If we have transparency and people and groups and different tribes are held responsible for the behavior, it's going to mean that we're spinning up a communal responsibility network, that when something that is seen that's out of control it arises, it gets called out, right? And so, we can call it cancel culture. And yeah, if cancel culture isn't a nuanced perspective on things, it can get out of control and have a lot of residual kind of fallout. But this is how humans live, right? Like we have to know what's going on, and when something's fucked up, we should call it out and go figure out how to address the problem. So yeah, I'm not really interested in that. The battling of straw men. And then to Jeremy's point too, the other move is, there's the nuanced perspective, but the other move is just to go down, right? And like just get more into the foundational element of these systems, and make sure that we're understanding that if we're only working in the middle layer of abstraction of the system, then it's going to be, we're gonna have a hard time moving much. And so to Jeremy's point, one of them is the economic lens, which is obviously way more foundational. And then I think even below the economic lens, this is where I bring in the spiritual lens, in the sense that, the way that I see spirituality, it is, understanding duality and how it works. And the kind of default kind of neurotic relationship with duality is to be fearful of nebulosity, the unknown, emptiness, whatever we want to call it. And if you look at our culture, our capitalist culture, it is just like exploiting that to the nth degree. It's, hey, if you get this, then everything, here will be the circumstances that life is good and you've arrived. And we tell the story over and over again. And so the majority of our culture lives this hedonic treadmill of, oh, I'm going to get it. Oh, I'm going to get it. Oh, I'm going to get it. It's just the carrot dangled in front of the, that's what our culture looks like in a lot of ways. And so much of what I see needed is that kind of spiritual foundation of understanding that nebulosity, unknown, that aspect of our experience is half of life, if not more. It's a giant portion of life, and if we try to deny it, will only lead to a neurotic relationship with life, where we're in constantly denying and trying to chase things that are phantoms and everything like that. So yeah, and the thing that excites me most about that is then it's like if we're able to kind of address this very foundational level, like then what, I have no idea even what, if we had more spiritual literacy, so we don't have all these neurotic relationships with duality, what kind of economic institutions and politics and things like that would arise. I have no idea, but I know it would be drastically different. So yeah, just a few threads to throw out there.
And that gets into, you mentioned near the beginning, Matt, of personal development, side that Hans emphasizes. And I'm remembering actually on Jim Rutt's podcast, he had the Nordic Secret Bjorkman on, and I mean, he makes a pretty good argument that these Nordic societies had this idea of bildung, of like personal development and actually like giving people opportunity to take some time off and to be in an environment where they can develop personally, and that it's an argument, it's probably a hypothesis that can be tested. So I think that's definitely I don't know, like so far we've been talking about kind of how do we structure society, bottom up, down, and I think going to the personal development lens, well, given kind of tribalist human nature, none of these things are going to work unless we have more mature humans, right? And so that's and so that absolutely can't be neglected. I mean, there's one elephant in the room that I want to address, and that is the predictions, they could be wrong, of ecological collapse, and what that will mean for these discussions about an ideal society. And I think if I were to make a hopeful prediction, it would be that given that there's going to be some kind of collapse of our substructure of civilization, there will arise kind of a more networked and decentralized and localist clusters of individuals who can thrive, regenerating the landscape, caring for each other, and all of these things. And so I almost feel like I'm not sure that, so Daniel Schmachtenberger would call this like a forcing function. And I'm not sure that this kind of transformation of society that we're all kind of trying to envision, if it would occur without personal development. And I think that, it probably won't occur without some forcing functions, and hopefully they're strong enough that it gets us to change, but not so strong that it wipes us all out immediately. And there's going to be collateral damage, but I don't know, how do we prevent as much collateral damage as possible? Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah, that's something I've been bringing up on my Mutations podcast past couple of months during this whole crisis, which is how do we mitigate human suffering and non-human suffering during this transitional period? Because like you, Jason, I also take the perspective that we're probably entering a period of civilizational collapse just due to the environmental and climatological pressures of just not being able to sustain, hyper-industrial neoliberal capitalism in an age of great extinction, the sixth great extinction, and then all of the other dynamics that are going on. And then internally, I think we're seeing a similar, while not related to biology directly, by analogy or perhaps isomorphic to social, systemic, and cultural collapse with neoliberalism. So I think we're seeing it both in the sociological and also in the biological and planetary. So that is already, as you're saying, happening. Like Gebser would say, what is happening today is happening of itself, right? Like this is almost a deconstructive decompositioning process that we're already in the middle of. And so that really will be, for better or worse, I mean, honestly, it'd be great if we could jump to some enlightened bioregional regenerative culture without the crisis, but the crisis is a mutual learning process in which we are learning to let go of some of these substructures and adopt new ones. And I think we can learn a lot from the way in which we're falling down, right? The way in which we're collapsing, and the kind of, I guess, laws, principles, dynamics that we really need to begin to learn, right? And one of the biggest ones, of course, is, okay, well, capitalism is, as we understand it, is not sustainable with a bioregional vision of the planet. What can we really sustain here? What does economics look like? post-collapse. And even though these are very anticipatory questions, I think they're also deeply practical ones as we enter this in a more intensified way. The other point I was going to bring up with Jared about the spiritual, it was sort of like the last thing I tacked into that Twitter thread, just sort of dropping the phenomenology or cultural phenomenology, because capitalism is, I mean, this is where leftists kind of like to get at me, because they're like, hey, you're moving away from the material analysis of things, right? But capitalism's an expression of a particular cultural phenomenology, a way of being in the world, right? Highly dualistic, extractive. Somebody's playing some music and driving by here. But because of that, we really need to understand some of the ways in which we, as human beings in the world, are, in some sense, sort of bringing forth capitalism, right? Like, what is it in us that brings this forth in the world, both individually and socially, mutually? And we have to learn how to retract that. And I think that is a deeply spiritual interior work, as much as it is an exterior social supersession, right? Like, how do we realize this collectively and socially? How do we realize this spiritually as human beings that have no interest in perpetuating that, right? Like, how do we be in the world differently? Because if we can culturally do that, and if we can individually do that, I think that is a way in which we can live in the future in a not abstract way, in the most embodied human-centric and non-human-centric way, post-humanistic kind of way. So I don't know. I think we're all struggling with that, right? But that's where it starts. And all the credit for you guys bringing that up.
Well, yeah, and I'd say to since I'm the to bring in the right perspective, like I'm not really, I think capitalism plays a very specific role, and it has a very specific dynamics about it that afford an extremely efficiently calibrated way of allocating resources. And so what fascinates me the most is this idea of, what if we were to personally be engaging in the world with the people that we are around, and how we spend our money and where we give our attention, that was more healthy individually. I think capitalism would just, so many of the neurotic outcomes that are, built on this illusion of eventually getting enough, never getting, constant growth. And instead, capitalism was more about establishing a foundation of goods and services for people to, have security. I think it could be, it feels like, markets and things like that have the dynamics to allow that to be happening in a very healthy way. But this is kind of the cart before the horse situation, where it's like, where do we step in here? Maybe, my relationship with how I spend my money and everything like that have drastically changed, and the types of food I buy and the clothes and everything like that, like all have this whole overlay of, is this, really taking some ownership over the impact that's having. If everybody were to do that, maybe some of those residual collateral damage would be lessened to a large degree. And I also see capitalism as just a small portion, right? I don't think it should not be all pervasive. It should be a section of life, and has very specific purposes. But the commons are something that needs to be there. Social services, I think, that are something that needs to be things, and they'll all be somewhat interconnected, but very, I see them being in relationship with each other instead of being in competition so much.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, where the discussion of scale and localism really comes in as well. And it is also, I think, requires some kind of spiritual developmental process where, because global capitalism is not good at internalizing costs, right? It externalizes costs for the most part. When we go buy really cheap groceries at Walmart or something, we're outsourcing the costs, of that to people that we've never met. And, the idea behind localism is that you are, and you mentioned this, Jared, that you are very aware of where you are, what you are buying. So so there's one element where it's like, getting over this kind of, hedonic treadmill of needing to buy things to fulfill yourself. So you're taking on, some kind of ethos of frugality, of thrift, right? But there's also a density of interactions, both, in terms of politics, both and economics, where, who you're buying from, and that, there was a fair interaction there. Or, you can go meet the people that you're buying from, right? And you're also aware, for me, because I studied food systems, and that's kind of, a main thing on my mind. It's like, how is this grown? Did this, result in, were the costs outsourced to future generations that don't have any topsoil and actually can't grow food anymore, or not, right? And so knowing where I buy my products from, like that's, so in a way you could say that finding the appropriate scale, which is usually a more local scale, is, it's not anti-capitalistic necessarily. There's markets involved. There's also the commons, hopefully, and there's mutual aid, and there's barter, and there's many kind of interlocking systems. But it's kind of forcing, the markets to account for all of the costs to all of the people, right?
Yeah.
And all of the benefits.
It's creating a demand for sustainable, or ideally regenerative foundations and systems and companies.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is especially with the food thing, this is so key for me, because it's like, for the vast majority of human history, almost all of our income and time was put into getting food, right? And it was, and now we live in this weird world where we can spend a very small portion of our income on food and not really worry about where it comes from, and that creates all these shortcuts. And so like, and it's a bit of a hard pill to swallow. The vast, there's the amount of money that we spend on food is ridiculous, because we're those kind of hippies that look for the locally grown, grass-fed, free range, cage free, every buzzword you can think of, kind of cliche, kind of paleo buzzword that you can think of. But so much of that is just because of partially the health impacts for me as well. But yeah, the market demands and what kind of behavior we're reinforcing. And so the more money we're putting in there, the more of a demand we're creating in a market to be regenerative or to be sustainable.
Yeah, and this gets back to Wendell Berry's argument. I also think that more people, and I'm not, I've come across as anti-urban, and sometimes I felt that way in the past. But I do think that more people do need to get back to the land and become at least part-time farmers. Have that relationship, because this kind of situation where less than 5% of the population are farmers, for me, that's only sustainable through this extractive industrial ag. Like there's no other way around it. And, couple that with, because agriculture was, the predominant occupation of most of the people, throughout most of history, it's also the foundation of culture. And the fact that rug has been so quickly taken out from under us, and what's replaced it is this hyper specialized dependence on a massive fragile system. I think a lot of that is what accounts for the meaning crisis. So a lot of the, I think a lot of our modern ills can be traced back to losing our foundation of culture itself.
Fragile and destructive and violent,
Right.
in so many dimensions: the economic dimension, the animal welfare dimension, our own health dimension.
Right.
It's these things are kind of pushed aside, but yeah, it is extremely, it's just a violent system, fragile system that we're all relying on.
Best of both worlds, right?
Yeah, I agree with you guys that I think this is where the kind of integral or deep historical awareness comes in, right? Because we're talking about the civilization based on industrial the industrialization of human cultures, really. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
starting over the past 300-400 years, maybe beginning with colonialism and humanistic principles, expanding into the Industrial Revolution, moving everyone kind of into these siloed, industrial-oriented, worker-oriented, lifestyles. We've been denatured, we've been decultured, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Gebser even has this sort of interesting phrase when he's talking about it, that, the fact that these processes removed our ability to craft our own food, our own items and objects in our house, right? Remove the kind of artistic embodied poesis of making, leaves us kind of bereft of this process of participating in our own meaning making, right? And of course, there's these larger perspectival issues in terms of the loss of meaning and existentialists in the 20th century and the industrial wars of the 20th century. So there's just been this sort of a compounding sense of history being carrying us forward into a catastrophe, like Walter Benjamin talks about, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, like the way I'm phrasing this, it sounds like I'm kind of a Wendell Berryan myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting, like between Latour and Gebser and some other thinkers too, like even I think Joe Brewer's work, that the answer is not, to retreat from industrialization exactly, but industrialization is in its death process, and that's what I really do believe. But we can't go forward into globalization, and that's why I really like Latour's kind of visualization of this, and that like we're really kind of going into the sidereal direction, back down to earth, down to the terrestrial again.
Almost like you're growing down.
Almost like we're growing down. That's right. And this is so concordant with what Gebser talks about, with the turn from perspectival abstraction to higher and higher progressive and more in the same line of thinking into concretion, right? Which is a sidereal turn. So a concretion, embodiment, aperspectivalism, etc. So I think there's some really deeply coherent themes that we can talk about in terms of the transitional times we're in. And maybe as a critique for folks like, I appreciate Limburg and I appreciate what they're doing, but a critique for the keeping things at the memetic level of all these different stages of cultural evolution battling each other really misses this deep coherence that both, localists and quote unquote progressives could get on board with, which is, okay, this civilization is in its death process. This is deeply historical. This is deeply spiritual. This is deeply culturally phenomenological. And there's a lay of the land. There's different ways to address it, but we can kind of reorient, right? I think there's this coherence here that is not abstract.
A very agricultural metaphor that Joe Brewer likes to use is composting. Like what parts, there's so many artifacts from culture that have been developed unsustainably, but they're here, and equipment and so many things that, we don't have to throw them away. They can be used as compost, right? He uses the metaphor of compost. And I'm a little bit wary of that metaphor because, he talks about composting the crumbling civilization and like, that could be taken in a very kind of eco-fascist direction of like composting humans. And like, so I just want to make it clear that I hope that's not what Joe Brewer is talking about, but that's definitely not what I'm talking about. It's much more of, utilizing, not going back to the past, but bringing the past in the future, but utilizing even all of these unsustainable products and materials, like they can be composted into creating the bridge to, to a more, cosmo-local, bioregional, et cetera, future. We don't have to start from ground zero, right? Like we have, you can still use, we still have, like in the permaculture community, a lot of people talk about, look, we're running, fossil fuels, we're not going to have fossil fuels forever. But if you're trying to jumpstart, say, some kind of permacultural system, you should not shy away from using some tools, modern tools that are going to be greatly helpful in this process, right? From like, using a drill that requires electricity, or, some things, you could be much more efficient with if you, rely a little bit on fossil fuels until you try and get it to this more self-sustaining, autopoietic kind of, off the grid kind of system, right? Or Mark Shepard, in his book Restoration Agriculture, he talks about, he still thinks that we're going to need machinery to harvest, right? Like while he wants to have these food forests that are basically self-perpetuating, in order to harvest, having harvesting machinery is a lot more efficient, and it's not damaging, in the way that other technologies are. And this is a technology maybe that can be solar powered, right? But we're not, so it's not like, I don't think the bioregional movement should go in an anti-technological way. It's like, okay, how can we, utilize these technologies in a way that's appropriate and sustainable, right?
Yeah, I just had to make one little analogy, because of course I got to make the spiritual analogy, but the same dynamic of kind of this composting, right? Like using the baggage and the kind of grossness of life to be generative. From a tantric perspective, this is very aligned with the way that you approach emotions, right? So a lot of the kind of more renunciative versions of spiritualism basically say, like, nurture the positive, do everything good, and then just keep the others, don't touch the other stuff, all the negative stuff, leave it as it is, and just kind of disconnect from it in some sense. It's creating a transcendent paradigm. But from a tantric perspective, it's like, hey, all those emotional turbulence and shit that you have to deal with in your own neurotic derangement that you've accumulated throughout your life, actually deeply engage with them and bring a lot of attention and awareness to them. Don't put them out of sight, out of mind. And if you can do that, they actually become fuel for genuine transformation and energetic expression engaged with your entire life. And so, it's a very power-oriented stance to the spiritual path. And yeah, I think that's something else that we need is, let's be aware of all the shit that's going, and stop trying to hide it away, because that's one thing that capitalism, especially and Western capitalism, from my perspective, really just goes out of their way to, well, don't look at this stuff, don't look at all the bad, just pack it away.
Don't notice that we're, all of our pollution sites are in minority communities, and
and it's uncomfortable to be with, but it can be used as kind of kindling for a alchemical kind of transformation of the way that we engage with life.
Yeah.
Well said. So we're coming up on 2 hours, so I suppose we could wrap it up here, guys. So any final thoughts, and any kind of contemplations moving forward with your mutual projects?
Well, I just want to say that I think I'm not as worried now about the Both And podcast ending for the foreseeable future. I think, really good, nuanced conversations are in good hands with you guys, and so I'm very happy that you guys are, doing this, and I really admire all of you guys. And so, yeah, you help me to, there's a niche that I think we are trying to fill, and I think you guys are really picking up the slack. So that makes me very, very hopeful.
Yeah, we talked to them again. Like, I think I said pass the baton in our last episode to the growing down folks. But yeah, I like we'll give the pass the flame from our torch, and whatever, empower the life force that you guys are bringing. Because I echo everything that Jason would say. So I'm excited.
Awesome. I really appreciate that, and hopefully we keep it lit. And if you guys ever want to pass it back, just let us know, and hopefully we'll still have it going.
Well, the thing about fire, once it really gets lit, is that it spreads, and so if we ever come back, we can just collectively create a bigger fire. So it doesn't have to be, we don't have to steal your fire. We can
Absolutely.
just,
there's a lot of fire to go around.
There's a lot of fire to go around, yeah, and there's a lot of underbrush. Sustainable forestry that needs to be cleared out, so you could have the big redwood trike trees grow again.
Yeah, thank you
those
so
metaphors.
much,
Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Cool.
Awesome.